Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Lewis F. Powell Jr. was an American lawyer and Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1971, Powell wrote a memo that outlined a strategy for corporations to band together and influence American institutions to be more sympathetic to business interest. This memo is often credited with sparking the rise of conservative think tanks and lobbying organizations such as the Heritage Foundation. Most agree that the ideas and strategies proposed in the Powell Amendment have come to fruition. It worked. Now, 50 years later, the Heritage Foundation released a new memo, Project 2025. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We're here with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm glad to have you on our podcast, Frank. And I'm going to introduce you with a couple of bullet points. You are a painter, as we can see for those watching this video behind me. You're a New York Times bestselling author, dozens of books, fiction and nonfiction.
Correct, yes.
A movie director, although you don't really say you were a great movie director, but
no, I was not. But I did direct 4 shitty commercial Hollywood action, thriller, and horror movies. So, that was so long ago. I think it happened to somebody else.
It paid the bills. You're an early blogger and Substack writer, and that's why we are chatting with you, because I'm just so you wrote a Substack a month ago, and I think it was just quite remarkable, and I'd like to sort of discuss that with you.
Sure.
And you're a survivor of an evangelical fundamentalist childhood.
Yeah, and to bookend that and explain the Band-Aid, an evangelical childhood at one end of my life, and at age 72 now, a melanoma that was removed by a good surgeon in Boston 2 weeks ago, but I've still got a little ding in the middle here. So nobody shot me in the forehead.
Well, I read your book Crazy for God years ago.
Thank you.
A remarkable overview of your relationship with your very, very wonderful and interesting father and childhood, which you can't really make up how interesting your childhood is.
Yeah.
And I just got back from Austin, Texas, short visit with friends visiting, and I just finished your Why I'm an Atheist That Believes in God book, which is I don't think either of these are your latest book, but they kind of put a
Well, they kind of are my latest books, and more or less. I don't know the chronology, but they're certainly very, Crazy for God is like 15 years old, but then Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God is more recent. So
right. Let's talk let's talk about your Substack, and then I want to go back into a lot more topics surrounding this. I'm raised Catholic. My father was Catholic. I went to church. I missed this many that many Sunday masses all the way until I was in high school, and there is a part of Catholicism that many of my cousins are still involved with that is an extremely conservative bent of Catholicism. And you wrote a Substack on August the 16th, The Duty to Warn, Why I May Tell You What Project 2025 Really Is.
Yeah.
Let me just start there and give us some background about how you see the Project 2025.
Well, you referred to my evangelical background. So the first thing is that, having been raised in an evangelical community in Switzerland, of all things, an American mission in Switzerland, established in the late 1940s, my childhood taking place in the 50s and 60s. Obviously, I grew up with a theologian, philosopher, evangelist father as someone who, was very attuned to the world of religious ideas. And so I literally got that with my mother's milk. We were on a mission to save everyone and so forth. And some of the people we were trying to save were Roman Catholics, who at that point, evangelical Protestants did not even regard as, quote, real Christians because they didn't have correct theology. So that's a whole different thing. But it means that even though I grew up in the religious right and fled my nepotistic relationship with my father as his sidekick on the big time American evangelical trail, as it were, in the 70s and 80s, and a book and film project he made with Dr. C. Everett Koop called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which historians kind of credit with starting the evangelical wing of the anti-abortion movement. You know, back in those days, some of the people who hailed our presence within that anti-abortion movement were people like Cardinal Law, who was eventually kicked out of Boston for being a party to sexual molestation of children and covering for priests, and people like that who back in the day, I actually spoke on a podium with him once, a pro-life kind of gathering in Boston. Archbishop Fulton Sheen of New York, who had a TV program in the 50s and 60s. I forget the name of it, but it was very popular. When we came into contact with some of these Roman Catholic luminaries, I was my dad's producer of this film series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and they kind of welcomed us like a besieged group of people in the Alamo, and the cavalry finally comes over the hill to relieve them. It was like, you know, welcomed us as kind of fellow travelers on a shift toward the right wing, fellow travelers in terms of reestablishing traditional values. A little footnote just before I get into Opus Dei and J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson and these other guys who were all part of Project 2025. Just note that in those days, our big fight on abortion was not with quote unquote secular people, the women's organizations, Planned Parenthood, and so forth. Our big fight was with other evangelical leaders, most notably the Reverend Billy Graham, who, as you well know, was a big, very, very big deal in evangelicalism. He founded the magazine Christianity Today, basically put Wheaton College, this Christian seminary college, on the map. He was pro-choice, and most people don't realize that back in those days, the evangelical movement was not knee-jerk on these, quote, family values issues. There was not a series of litmus tests. There were plenty of Republicans and Democrats who were evangelicals. It wasn't assumed that you voted for Republicans or that you were even particularly conservative. You know, church-going evangelicals were as pro-choice as they were pro-life, but they weren't either, really. They were kind of ambivalent to the issue. People don't really figure that. In fact, Dr. Criswell, who was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention at that time, and was a friend of my father's and myself, actually, we argued with him because he had preached a sermon when Roe v. Wade was up for debate on why he thought the Supreme Court was doing the right thing by giving women choice. I mean, believe it or not, this is the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And for anybody that knows anything about American church groups, this was a group of people founded so they could hold slaves in good conscience back in the day. This is the far right of the evangelical movement. And the reason I mention that is because if you want to fast forward to the Trump election cycle in 2024, and fast forward to people like Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court, and fast forward to both the Roman Catholic conservative and conservative political majority on the court, the Trump appointments and some that preceded him from the Bush era, you can't really understand these people unless you understand the context out of which my family's activism in the 70s and 80s came. And that was a kind of the beginning of what we call the culture wars. And essentially, my family, my father, Francis Schaeffer, argued with Billy Graham, Dr. Criswell, and others, the board of Christianity Today magazine, various Christian college presidents, and tried to call them to quite join our cause. And what we found to our surprise is the only people who were really fellow travelers in that cause were Roman Catholic bishops or people like the Knights of Columbus that put about $250,000 into our project and helped fund the movie. And I can remember Cardinal Archbishop Fulton Sheen welcoming me at his apartment on Park Avenue in New York, a very luxurious place, actually, for my evangelical eyes. He had a little private chapel and a place to pray. And he asked me to kneel with him, which I did at the wonderful ripe old age of 20, and offer this project up to God. And this was in the context of me going to him to get him to use his Knights of Columbus connections in New York City so we could have permission to film in the big Roman Catholic graveyard that actually a scene from The Godfather had been filmed in. And that got the Catholic Church in all sorts of trouble because Francis Ford Coppola kind of desecrated the place by putting mobsters with real graves and people's names on them visible. Okay, this is a long preamble to say that when I talk about understanding where the Project 2025 comes from, I knew the people back in the day, in the 70s and 80s, in the Heritage Foundation when it was forming, in the Federalist Society when it was forming, who were friends of my father's. And now today, some of the leaders are actually younger than the people I knew, but they are the intellectual stepchildren of the people we knew in the 70s and 80s. And our project then was, how do we take America back in terms of reestablishing what we regarded as the Christian values being lost by the gay movement, the women's movement, abortion, and so forth. And we picked the abortion issue as the kind of litmus test that we would sail under. Our friend Jerry Falwell was so enamored, the evangelist and the preacher and the guy who started the Moral Majority, that he lent us his jet, believe it or not, to fly around America to speak at our seminars. And little by little, we put together a coalition which literally bullied, I use the word advisedly, people like Billy Graham and Dr. Criswell and others into silence. In other words, you were not a real Christian unless you signed on with us. And we found that our allies were not Roman Catholics per se, who were much more liberal in their views. For instance, my wife's parents, who were Democrat voting liberal Roman Catholics in San Francisco, very typical people, very much the same kind of people who were going to mainline Protestant churches if they were Protestants. Our battle was to get the evangelical movement as radicalized as we were becoming. And so by the time the 1980s rolled around, my dad wrote a book called A Christian Manifesto, which actually called for the violent overthrow of the US government if it continued to emulate what he said was the direction of Nazi Germany and the eugenics movement and so forth when it came to abortion and its access to contraceptives and so forth and so on. So we found weirdly that far-right Roman Catholics were more allied with our views than most evangelical Protestants at that time. And then gradually a shift took place. Okay, fast forward to the Trump campaign in 2024. And for 2 years, preparatory to that campaign, Project 2025 has been put together, a 900-page document of research by people at the Heritage Foundation, headed up by radically right-wing Roman Catholics who also happen to be members of Opus Dei. Now, you know, your average American 72-year-old doesn't go around thinking about Opus Dei, but given my weird background, I do, and I'll tell you why. Because of a strange fellow traveler, friend of my father's, was someone called Archbishop Lefebvre of France, who broke with the church over putting the communion into the vernacular, French and English, and he wanted it kept in Latin. And he came to L'Abri Fellowship, where my father was in Switzerland one time, and all my answers are not going to be this long, but this was complicated. And he laid out an agenda where he and my dad agreed we're really on the same side. My father was against modernism, humanism, liberalism. He talked about culture from the point of view of a slide from the Renaissance into the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment to the French Revolution, the anti-clerical aspects of the French Revolution, and so forth. And Lefebvre and him were like bosom pals. Well, Lefebvre was also a member of Opus Dei, and Opus Dei was founded in its modern form in Spain during the tyranny of Francisco Franco. So it's a fascist Roman Catholic organization that was founded in order to bolster Franco's claims to power, his authoritarian/totalitarian regime. And Opus Dei had historical roots, but the modern version comes out of Franco's Spain. So when people say Opus Dei is fascist, in this case, it's not a debatable. It literally comes out of one of the European fascist movements. Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, Franco's Spain. Well, Opus Dei was to Franco's Spain what the Lutheran Church was in Germany, as it cited Martin Luther for its anti-Semitic twist and welcomed Hitler. But Opus Dei went further and said basically that less radical Roman Catholicism is the enemy, much like Trump today looks at America and talks about the enemy within. He means liberal or Democrat voting Americans. So Opus Dei is a really nefarious organization. It's not like the Knights of Columbus that was fundraising for schools and all the rest, or building hospitals. Lots of wonderful Catholic organizations. Half the hospitals in America have a saint's name because some nun decided to actually help people. So I'm not down on Catholics. But Opus Dei happens to be something that most Catholics, when they would find out about it, would never join any more than most white Protestants would join the Ku Klux Klan. Now, it happens a lot of Klan members are white Protestant Southern Baptists, but that doesn't mean that most Southern Baptists want to join the Klan. Well, most Roman Catholics would not be caught dead at an Opus Dei meeting because of its history. They're not any more pleased about the association with Franco's fascist regime than most evangelicals are about the fact that Lutherans sold out to Hitler. It's a moment of shame in history. All right, so fast forward to now. When I found out that the people who were managing the Project 2025 project were not only Opus Dei members, but committed Opus Dei members within the leadership structure, including Leonard Leo at the Heritage Foundation, not the Heritage Foundation, at the Federalist Society, who has sort of spearheaded people like Amy Coney Barrett and others coming onto the court. The weird thing is, in this case, it's an actual conspiracy. Now, we live in an age when there's weird conspiracism on the left and right, attributions of things that aren't happening. But in the case of Opus Dei, it actually is a secretive right-wing organization that's been there since Franco, used in Spain to control the church, murder priests who didn't go along with it, for real, murder other people, say that he was a true Catholic as part of his fascist regime. So the weird thing is that, here we are in 2024 looking at Project 2025. And when you parse the details, they talk about, for instance, rolling back the access to contraceptives. And they put within Project 2025, this will be one of our harder tasks, unlike reversing Roe v. Wade, because so many Americans have gone there. They talk about reversing gay marriage. They talk about reversing gay rights. By the time you get to transgender stuff, that's totally off the chart. They're talking just about basic gay rights. In addition to which, deconstructing the entire federal government, replacing it with far-right sycophants, Trump boosters, but beyond that, a bigger vision. And so when you look at what the actual agenda of Project 2025 is, and I'm not exaggerating, if they achieved everything in Project 2025, we would be living in Franco's Spain, because contraceptives would be illegal, abortion would be illegal, homosexuals would be in jail or executed as they were in Franco's Spain. I'm not making this shit up. This is really what their project would achieve. And it is not one of these loose kind of whimsical things. It has its roots back into a cultural phenomena that goes back into the fascism of pre-war Europe, pre-World War II Europe. And I grew up knowing about it because my dad had Archbishop Lefebvre as a friend, and he would come to L'Abri and discuss the culture, and they agreed about secular humanism, they agreed about the left wing, they agreed about liberalism, etc. So when this all happened, and people start asking me, how can evangelicals support Trump because he, paid off a porn star? It's so naive, because the fact of the matter is Trump is a footnote. The actual program, the actual project is the people who want to manipulate his second presidency. And I just want to finish with this. J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson are recent converts to the far right wing of the Roman Catholic Church. They didn't join the Catholic Church because they like Roman Catholic spirituality. These are not men making pilgrimages to Assisi. They joined the Roman Catholic Church precisely because the kind of people who are in Opus Dei putting together Project 2025 are their kind of people. Far right ideologues who are as Catholic as I am, and I'm not Catholic, and who are all about using the historical structure of the Roman Catholic Church in a way, and again, this is not an exaggeration, that resembles the sort of thing that the bad popes, quote unquote, were doing in the 11th century as they invaded the city-states of Italy and wanted to take it over and make it all one papal empire. End of explanation.
Let
And
me let
unlike a lot of commentators on this, I actually happen to know what I'm talking about. About
let, let,
this, not melanoma, but this.
let me get Greg involved with this. Greg is probably much more so than me was involved in activism and union organizing
Yeah.
and civil rights. Greg, when you were a puppy, when you were in graduate school, uh, the Christian church was not necessarily the enemy of the causes that you believed in. I mean, weren't they involved in civil rights and they were involved in poverty? It was the it didn't have the ugliness that the fundamentalist branch of the church has now. I mean, am I correct in that, in expressing that with
You can't.
your early activism?
First, I'm an atheist. I'm unabashed, unashamed. I don't believe in God, but I'm fascinated with the history of the church, and I have been, and I know a bit about it as well. But you can't paint Christianity or any other religion with one brush, and I think that's a dangerous thing to do. There was a World Federation of Churches, which was by today's measure, a very liberal left-wing kind of organization, which was an umbrella group for a whole host of Protestantism, I like to call it Protestantism, as it originated. And that umbrella encompassed the Episcopalians and Methodists and yada, yada, yada. I happened to find as a child, being situated in a First Church of Christ fundamentalist setting in the Midwest, so I know a bit about it from firsthand experiences. That was that was opposed to this World Federation of Church kind of liberalism. So there were all kind of currents going on. A bit older than both of you, and so I go back to my moment is 1960, when my aunt, who was a Democrat, a fervent Democrat, got up out of the pew in the front of the First Church of Christ and stomped out, and I'm in the back, playing around with my friends, and she says, "Let's go, Gregory." I find out that our minister had endorsed Richard Nixon and not John Kennedy, and she was a fervent Kennedy supporter. What was behind that for these churches was basically the fear of Catholicism. I mean, it wasn't Opus Dei or this wing or that wing. They just thought Catholics were going to take over if John Kennedy got elected.
Yeah.
So I think this is what's being said here. It's a very complex question. There are all kind of trends. Opus Dei, I think, in America, you're exactly right. I love the fact that you brought up Franco Spain. It does originate there as a movement, but the backdrop to that was the conservatism of the Spanish church in general, which welcomed Opus Dei. But in America, in the United States, Opus Dei is an influence on the party because so many powerful, moneyed people have supported it. And the mainstream of the Catholic Church likes that. That's why they're anti-Francis. That's why they're anti the liberation theology and so on, because that's where the money is. They have a much larger influence, and I think you've suggested that, over the Catholic Church than its numbers. Most Catholics don't even know what the hell it is.
Yeah.
But it is a very, very powerful force there. And I think you're probably right. I think people like Vance and a couple of three Supreme Court justices are infatuated with Opus Dei.
Well,
They
Theo too.
Undeserved influence over U.S. politics.
Yeah, Frank, before you answer, I want to say one thing about your upbringing, really kind of related to this. LeBray, when in your book, why I'm an atheist that believes in God, you mentioned in 1970s you'd have lectures at your place in Switzerland on Bob Dylan lyrics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
you would allow homosexuals could worship with
my
you.
dad's influence was such that was founded on the fact that other evangelicals were looking at him, looking for techniques to, quote, reach the young people, because he was actually interested in art and culture. He welcomed people. Gay people were at L'Abri. We had, rock and roll guys from England. My first paying job when I was a teenager was down in Montreux at the music festival. He had no problem with me driving down on my moped to help with the light show, etc. He was interested in art and culture. The thing where it all went off the rails was that, as he's now remembered by the religious right as kind of one of their founding fathers, it's only because of, quote, the position he took on abortion. And that then led to him becoming someone that gave the far right, like Jerry Falwell, some respectability. Otherwise, they would not have had that. And essentially, the foundation of that. In other words, if you go up through the 1960s and 70s and look at his lectures and his books, you would not peg him as someone from the far right. Only after he got involved with C. Everett Koop and made that series and that book that I then directed the film version of and helped him put together, in my late teens and early 20s, did that whole thing change. And then the fame he got and the popularity he got, essentially moved him to the right, much in the same way that J.D. Vance is doing that now. J.D. Vance wrote, if you knew J.D. Vance Hillbilly Elegy, if that's all that you ever read of his, and then he disappeared from the scene, it would be tough to nail him down as a far right political person. Now he's kowtowing to Donald Trump because that's where the power is. And my father, in his essence, had been this rather obscure intellectual evangelical Christian in Switzerland, doing his thing, taking kids on tours of the Uffizi Gallery in Milan, et cetera, et cetera. His son, me being, began as an artist. And then all of a sudden, access to that market and the kind of big time American Christian scene, essentially, we all drank the Kool-Aid, and I don't know who influenced who, but we certainly came out very different people than we went in. And I eventually bailed and fled. I don't know if he had lived past 1984 when he died of cancer at age 72, the age I am now, whether he would have stayed with the program. That's a different discussion. But my background was not the one that, as I describe in my memoir, Crazy for God, it was a journey. And the good thing about that journey that I took, that kind of where my book becomes a template and why it gets used as textbooks in certain places, is that in my family story of the kind of seduction of the allure of power, and now that my parents are staying in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House with the Ford administration, it's the rock star syndrome. All of a sudden, you're the band Chicago. You start out as a really together, jazz, rhythm and blues kind of rock band group of people. Your first 3 albums, by the time you get to the 40th album or whatever they finally made, it's pop tunes, and you're making a ton of money, and you want to make another hit. I mean, there's nothing weird about the way Christians get seduced by power. That's the way of the world.
That's why I like your story, because you mentioned in the evangelical movement, it's the fathers pass on the power to their sons.
Yeah.
Billy Graham, Frank Graham, all of these. And you were in line. I mean, you were speaking. Am I getting this right? You spoke to 13,000 Southern
I was
Baptists.
the keynote speaker at the Southern Baptist Convention to 23,000 pastors in the audience the day I spoke.
And your reviews were that you were one of the best speakers they've had, or something.
That's right. Mantle, they said the mantle has passed. Like, your dad's getting old. He's at Mayo Clinic getting chemotherapy. Thank God, his son will continue. Much as Franklin Graham stepped into Billy Graham's shoes, started this huge mausoleum down there, and it's a going concern, big time God business.
So you had the baton in your hand,
yes,
and at some point in time, you said, "I think this isn't going to work," and I want to put a thesis to you. If you look at the fundamentalist Christo-fascism or Islam or some of these other really strong authoritarian central control religions, they're all male dominated. I mean, there's a male thing going on. You had on a woman who was a homeschooled woman that was a great podcast you had with her, and you talked about her father decided that she couldn't marry her boyfriend because he didn't pick her. I mean, the fathers picked the husbands for their children.
Yeah,
that's very weird.
That could be taking place today in Afghanistan right now.
right now, right now.
And yet hers is an American story, because within our story, we have these enclaves of super pietistic, whacked out, patriarchal little groups, churches, individual parents homeschooling kids, stuff going on that, is just outlandishly crazy in terms of mainstream culture, but they can do it here because of our ideas about religious liberty.
And to further my sequence here, you mentioned that you were not a very good father. You're a damn good grandfather.
I try
and,
to be.
and part of the not being a very good father is that it took you a while to break away from the fact that the man's the head of the church, the head of the household, and that you were not the patriarch know all, maha mahu. You're just a man in a relationship, and you don't necessarily have any great status because of your
Exactly
penis or whatever.
That's right.
And that is what broke you away from all this. Is it as simple as that, or is it more complex?
No, you're totally right. I mean, people keep asking me, why did you leave and so forth and so on. I say, well, obviously read my memoir, Crazy for God, whatever. But the fact of the matter is, it was not a theological issue with me. I know this will sound, sentimental, but I actually fell passionately in love with my wife, Jeannie, when we were teenagers. And I loved her enough to realize that she had married someone that, in terms of my own upbringing and training about, quote, a man's role, I had been groomed, and I'll put it bluntly, to become an asshole by divine right. God is on the side of asshole males. That's what I was groomed to believe. So when my dad screamed at my mom, and when he shoved her around, and basically, this was just, keeping women in their place. And when I was a father, I figured, you discipline your kids. And when I had disagreements with Jeannie, I would scream at her. But at the same time, I realized that these were things that something in me was saying I should change. But it's difficult to change when you've been trained that by being awful, you're doing the right thing. You're supposed to be in charge. You're supposed to be an asshole. That's what a Christian man is supposed to be, according to this form of biblical indoctrination. So basically, my departure from evangelicalism started for two reasons. And I think they're both aesthetic, if I could put it this way, rather than moral. I really craved a beautiful relationship with Jeannie. And there was only one thing getting in the way with it. It was me. And she was patient enough to stick around until I wanted to change for her. And then the second thing was the vision of art and culture. I happened to have bought that part of my father's thinking, and I went ahead loving music and loving art, painting and so forth, being asked to choose between the ugliness of big-time American religion, which is an aesthetic desert, literally on purpose, because it's all about the word, it's the Bible, it's never the image, and if you do art, it's just in order to evangelize people, or if you write, you're supposed to be propagandizing them. You never value the thing in itself intrinsically. I mean, they even look at love as a model of Jesus in the church, and rather than not, you don't just love Jeannie, that's a symbol of something greater, and that's why it has value. Well, maybe I began to think it had value in and of itself, both art and that. So for me, the beginning of my rebellion was simply that I began to understand that I was the problem in my relationships, my view of other people, the kind of people I liked, we thought were the enemy. And it wasn't that one day I made a choice, but I began to ask questions. Why am I such an asshole? What is it about me? How did I get this way? And you can't start picking at those threads if you're raised in a certain kind of environment without beginning to see more come away in your hand. So I had been indoctrinated to be a certain type of male, and this didn't work well with me. And it wasn't that Jeannie threatened to leave, although we had some big fights and she did at times, quite reasonably. It was that I actually loved her, and I really loved my children, and I wanted to find a way to do better. And the kind of people that I began to talk to, coincidentally, in one instance, was a woman, for instance, a fabulous person, Dr. Schwartz, who happened to be counseling my now 50-year-old son when he was a child, because he was very dyslexic like I was. And one time Jeannie said, well, why don't you talk to her? Because I kept saying, well, who can I talk to? They're all people within the ministry. You know, they know who we are. You don't blow your cover. And I began to talk to secular people who actually seemed to know something and were able to really help me out in a way that the kind of biblical approach of pray away your sin, or, you know, these are spiritual. We didn't even believe in psychology. They were all spiritual problems that if you really had sufficient faith in Christ, this ought to be okay. So basically, I just started looking for answers in places that I had never seen, and eventually, after, you know, in 1980, we moved from Switzerland, where we were living at the ministry, to the U.S. And I just at one point literally quit, and I didn't bail so much as write a book. I wrote a book called Portofino, which is a novel. It's a work of fiction. And I was lucky in that it was successful enough to give me permission to keep writing. And I was also lucky in another way, and that is that evangelical fundamentalist Christians hated it. And they said so because it's a work of humor at the expense of the kind of crazy childhood I had. It also happens to be a very funny book. And so they didn't like the fact that they themselves were laughing out loud at their own foibles when they read it, but it was embraced by some good literary critics and others here and abroad. Became a thing in England as well as here, and, you know, gave me permission to keep writing. And so essentially, you know, I was told no real Christian could write a thing like this, and actually, it's crazy because it's a very mild work of humor. Nobody's ever read it saying it's, you know, it's an anti anybody, but they didn't, you know, it wasn't part of the program. It was actual art, if I could say so myself, you know, that had its own value. So after Portofino, in a way, you know, it wasn't, you know, it was essentially, okay, I'm earning a lot less money. I'm not flying around anybody's private jet anymore. We can, you know, barely afford anything, but I'm writing some stuff I actually like. I'm no longer my dad's sidekick, and I'm beginning to ask some real questions. And then a journey started, which eventually wound up with me describing myself as an atheist who prays. So why would an atheist pray? Well, because my mom raised me that way. I have certain psychological crutches and needs. I don't regard them as truth issues anymore. It's just the way I am. It's like asking someone how they started smoking. Well, they began smoking when you're 12, and it's a hard habit to keep. So I don't smoke, but I do pray.
The question is a simple question. What is the attraction? What's the magnetism of the evangelical movement? Before you answer, here you could say it's tradition, it's been here forever, there is a long history, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm thinking about Brazil or Chile, places that have long traditions of Catholicism.
Sure.
Embedded. I mean, they've got churches on every corner, they've got priests, they've got a mechanism to control the way people think, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, today, there's an enormous attraction to evangelicalism in those countries, in those Latin American, South American Catholic countries. What is that? What is the magnet? What is the attraction?
Well, you know, I would not claim any expertise in that area, except to say this, and that is that evangelicals cater, you know, to people with very good marketing, in that they're not hooked to a tradition which is exclusionary. Anybody can be included if you just pray a simple mantra, Lord Jesus Christ, you know, I accept you as my savior, and you're in the door. And the other thing is they also cater to people on an emotional level of inclusion. So I think that, you know, we have an odd sort of brain, and that is it longs for inclusion. And we're, you know, basically evangelicals make you a member of the hunter-gatherer group again. You're in and you belong. And as long as you toe the line and be part of the group, you know, in an age that's very divided and lonely in terms of modern life, it's very attractive. So I think what the Roman convert to the evangelical movement in South America and Central America becomes is someone who has allowed free rein with emotion. And the trick is to pretend the pastor is not a priest and an authority figure. You don't have any hierarchy, so you're not bound by tradition. You can freely express yourself. But of course, each local pastor is a pope, and a very absolutist one, and you have to toe the line. But I think the difference is that there's an appeal to an emotionalism which is set free within evangelicalism, which is not too different than, you know, what the appeal was for a young person in 1967, say, to hitchhike to San Francisco and live on Haight-Ashbury for a while. and drop some acid and bop around. And one morning, they wake up in a commune in Oregon, and they've gone up there to make personal, peace on earth. It doesn't quite work out the way they planned, but it's nice to be part of a family for a while. And I think when you see the passion and the emotion let loose in, for instance, the Pentecostal churches and the charismatic churches that are now overwhelming evangelicalism, by the way. So this charismatic movement that's come out of Central America, these are the Trump voters who are joining a crusade to bring America values back. A lot of people in the Democratic Party have been surprised, thinking that because Trump is, a racist, that somehow these folks would be in their camp, but they're not going to be, because the attraction to the evangelical group is even stronger than the political attraction, which is kind of a left turn on my answer. But I really do think it's the emotional appeal and the belonging that was not offered them in a more cut and dried, either mainstream evangelical churches, or let alone the Roman Catholic Church. And that's the best I can think of it. That personal relationship with Christ, it's straight up reformational Lutheranism. It's just you and the Bible, nobody between you and God. Whatever you feel in the Spirit is true. It's God speaking through you. You have a prophetic voice, and that kind of agency that brand of evangelicalism gives people, I think, is very liberating to some people.
Before you came on, Greg and I were yelling at each other about politics, which is typical. And we were talking about how Trump being, voting for Trump, voting for Kamala, so forth.
Sure.
What I liked about your article is Trump is just a small part of all of this. He's not the problem. He's
No.
not this horrible demagogue this Franco that's coming in.
Right.
He is a byproduct of Powell in 1971 writing a memo and creating the Heritage Foundation, and now it happens to be the Heritage Foundation that's continuing with this. He's I don't know, he's 10% of the problem.
But the thing is, when you look at some of these hot, young, brilliant men who are either becoming Roman Catholics of the far right and or signing up to his program, like Elon Musk, J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, Thiel, these guys are not Trump. Their program is something very different, and that is they see him as a vehicle to power. And if I was Trump and got elected, I'd be looking over my shoulder, because these guys are not going to bide with him very long before they move in on it. And I don't know what the fallout will be, but they're a group of very, very power hungry, extremely well-financed young men who are now sitting in the wings. And Project 2025 gives them something to operate with on one hand, but what they're really about is power. So Elon Musk doesn't care about anything in Project 2025. He has his own agenda. He doesn't want to be regulated. And J.D. Vance has become completely immersed in a kind of a quest for that. Carlson got him the appointment to the vice presidential candidacy. Peter Thiel has his own followers, and they're waiting in the wings. And I think one of the big reasons to really do everything in our power to see that Kamala Harris is elected is nothing to do with Donald Trump or the religious right or anything else. It's that when you look at these sharks circling the tank, we have a problem. And that is, it isn't Trump. It's Elon Musk, J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, Thiel, these others. It's no accident that the Bitcoin people are dropping hundreds of millions of dollars into dark money, part of this campaign. These guys are very, very similar. And, I get sick of historical comparisons, but quite honestly, in 1933, when Hitler was elected, it's because he had some people who very stupidly, because his case was different, he had a program, but it was industrialists at Farben and these other companies who thought, oh, well, we can manipulate this guy, and we'll use him to do what we want to do in Germany from the point of view of flouting the law or regulation, what it may be. These guys are the American version of that. The only difference is they're really looking to, I think, dominate a fool who's easily dominated, because if you kiss his ass enough, he will do that. And basically people don't understand why Roe was reversed. It wasn't about abortion. It was that the people on the evangelical right, like Paula White and these others who were whispering in his ear, Franklin Graham, you mentioned him. They said, of course, we can bring you tens of millions of votes, but pro-life is our big issue. So just give us an indication that if we bring you a list of people to appoint to federal judgeships up and down the list, including the Supreme Court, you'll do it. And they had the list because the Federalist Society has been grooming these guys for 50 years. I met the founders back in the 1970s and 80s who were talking about finding young people even before college and getting them to train as lawyers so that eventually we could take over the courts. Well, quote unquote, we did. And it worked because the list was ready. So Leo and these other guys had the list. And so the problem was the list. The problem wasn't Trump. The problem was that he's the kind of person that if you kiss his butt, he'll do you a favor.
Right.
He doesn't care about abortion. He never did. But the people on the courts do, and they used him.
Right.
And these guys, the next iteration, J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, Tucker Carlson, Thiel, and these others have an agenda. Their agenda isn't abortion. Their agenda is to put people like themselves in the tech industry in an unregulated position of power and literally do what they want.
Right.
And we're going to be in very deep trouble.
I 100% agree with you, Frank. Greg, what do you say? Do you agree with Frank and me?
Well, no and yes. I mean, of course, yes, I agree with some things, and no, I disagree about others. But I think you don't have a large enough framework to talk about American politics. You have to put American politics in the framework of the international tendency towards right-wing populism. And that's where Trump fits in. Yeah, there's
Right.
aspects of our right-wing populism that are peculiar, that have more influence from that evangelicals. You don't have that in, let's say, Germany, where you have a right-wing populism that's growing enormously, or in France, where you have a different kind of right-wing populism, or in Italy with Maloney. When you look at all these things, they come back to a failure. If you group them as a whole or look at it globally, it's a failure essentially of the center-left. It's the collapse of the center-left in all these countries. Social Democrats in Germany, the Socialist Party and other left-wing groups associated with it in France. The demise of the Communist Party in 1991 in Italy, for example, which created chaos in its wake. And in this country, the complete failure since the mid-70s of the Democratic Party to return to anything like what people imagine to be its New Deal roots. It has swept in the same direction as the Republican Party has driven it. And so you get to a situation where you're really talking about the unpredictability of Trump is the only factor, the sole factor in deciding your vote, not the groundwork, not the framework, not the background to it, which frankly, whether he wins or not, that's going to continue unless we have a left-wing force in this country that comes forward and begins to fight, begins to win over people in the Midwest who are disgruntled because of deindustrialization, and can incorporate all these different movements into one whole and change this country in the other direction, which it has not been going in for decades and decades. So, I don't see the election as making much difference, frankly. I mean, beat up on anyone that's voting for Trump or someone's going to vote for Kamala. It doesn't matter at this point. We've let politics in this country degenerate to a point where it's almost meaningless, and what's ahead is frankly frightening as hell.
What do you say, Frank?
Well, I'm zeroing in on a point that Greg brings up that I think is right, and I would include India because you look at nationalism there, and I think that sometimes in America we're very U.S. centric, but the fact is we're part of a global phenomena of a strong move toward the right and authoritarianism, which is very anti-democracy at its root. Whether it's Hungary or France or whatever. So I totally agree on that. I would just say in the case of the U.S., I see it a little differently because I think that Kamala is somebody that I'm going to vote for very heartily and urge other people to. I do think it makes a difference because I'm not ready to unleash Musk and JD Vance and Tucker Carlson and Thiel and these other guys who I think are different than the industrialists who controlled American politics for so many years, like Morgan and the others, because they actually own the very means of communication. They're making our community, and it's not just Twitter come X. These tech bros are creating the world we live in on a level of manipulation and surveillance and algorithmic direction of putting us all in touch with people who live in our bubble in a way that almost makes what Greg is talking about impossible, because left-wing politics or right-wing politics, I think Greg's right, become a footnote to the kind of tech bro vision of technology itself being this kind of innate good that must never be questioned or regulated. So I think, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose in one way, but in another way, we're on a new playing field with dangers which, in a way, kind of cancel out discussions, because when you have an algorithmic setting that means that only people on Facebook who already agree with me see Frank Schaeffer posts, and the same for the right and the left, and that Musk has his 100 million followers or whatever, you're not on a field that's even pretending to be a level playing field anymore, because the kind of people who are the tech bros, their ambitions actually see this as a good thing. And the fact, they see technological advancement as the answer to everything. So, I think we're very much in the realm of people who really sincerely believe that they're kind of Ayn Rand's answer to humanity. They see themselves as supermen. They're not particularly political, but what it means is that very little of what ordinary people do counts, and they want to keep it that way. And so, Musk is a glaring example of that. And the way he's jumped into the Trump campaign is very calculated. He knows exactly what he's doing because he sees that as a step toward what he wants to achieve, which is, absolutely unbridled and uncontrolled. And so it's no coincidence, by the way, speaking of left-wing politics and liberal leaders, that Musk is very anti-union, done everything he can to undermine them. So have the folks at Amazon and so on. These guys are definitely, the new Gilded Age people. But I see the level of threat they pose as uniquely awful because of the tech that they have mastered. And in that sense, anybody who opens the door to them even an inch more, the result is going to be bigger than the fact that they just open the door an inch, because these guys are always going to be, everything or nothing people, and they're aiming for everything. I mean, Musk has a vision of absolute power. So does JD Vance, Tucker Carlson. These guys all think the same way.
I'd broaden the scope, though. I mean, I agree 100%, but you got to then look at the recent 2 days ago, the failure of the Washington Post, which is a newspaper that's solidly in the pro-Kamala column normally, their refusal to endorse a candidate.
Yeah.
And the reason comes back, as you say very thoroughly, a tech bro, Jeff Bezos, has a pending contract with the U.S. government, which he's basically saying, don't endorse anybody because I don't want to have to pay out of my pocket for the loss of this contract, depending on who gets elected. So now he's in a great position. The Washington Post is historically on the side of the Democrats, and yet he hasn't endorsed. If Trump does get elected, he still can say, look, I withheld the endorsement.
Yeah, exactly. And these guys are all the same.
Think of the power. That could turn the whole friggin' election.
Yeah, and then when you find out that Musk has had at least 9 private phone calls, according to the press, which he doesn't deny, with Vladimir Putin, head of SpaceX and Starlink and Tesla, talking directly as if he's a government already, these guys already see themselves in a kind of a power that transcends elected officials anyway. And they love the idea of Project 2025 because their whole program is to deregulate everything, abolish the federal government as we understand it, and give free rein to the quote market. So my problem is that if Kamala doesn't win, I mean, it's almost the end of the discussion, because now we've unleashed the real catastrophe. Whereas with Kamala in office, Greg, I think we have a chance of rebuilding the liberal left and the traditional left, and really trying to sort things out. And it may be that this close call opens some doors to some people in the younger generation actually considering, genuine proposals from the left, whereas the door is completely slammed shut if Trump comes into power, not because of him, but because the people who are very quickly going to take over that presidency.
I want to change the subject. You are an artist. We have here for 60% of the people listen to this podcast,
Right.
so I'll have a link to your art, Frank Schaeffer
Yeah.
art. This is a inauguration day 2007, God punishing Donald Trump by showering him with French carbon steel knives, Pinocchio dolls, etc.
Yeah.
What wonderful, wonderful painting. And then we have here, let me move my mic down so we can see. This is the Holy Trinity. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit revealed themselves as three teddy bears, and so forth. You're a good artist, and
Thank
I
you.
wouldn't be surprised if you show up at a cocktail party where people don't know you and they ask, what do you do for a living? You'd say, well, I'm a painter. Is that, am I correct that you might say that?
Yes, I would be glad to do that. And I think, I have a lot of self-doubt when it comes to, hey, I've written these books, but should have I just been stuck with painting and then, and so forth, a little too many other things sometimes. But I dropped painting for a while, but I must say I find the painting extremely satisfying, and continue to work at it and paint in series. So you've got two from that series there with the Pinocchios and the teddy bears, and basically using childhood toys as my models, and then finding titles that kind of amuse me. Um, so yeah, you're right.
And
And
so
I've
many,
got the original of one of these here that you've got behind you, the Pinocchio there. That's the painting we're looking
right,
at behind
right.
you.
And so many people, I think, come to the end of their life, like Joni Mitchell. She describes herself as a painter, not a poet,
Yeah,
not a
well,
singer.
Joni Mitchell's a good example of someone who picked it, who's always been really good, and that could have been, quote, all she did.
Right. Same thing.
So,
John Mellencamp, Bob Dylan. I mean,
yeah,
just go down the list.
yeah.
They have their career, they make their money, but I think their heart is in their artwork. And I kind
Yeah,
of
and I
see,
think, for me, I'm kind of an ambitious guy, in when it comes to art, but I'm very much out of step with the sort of Basel Art Fair type painter, artist, things. I'm a painter, and art interests me, and art history interests me. I'm not sure I'm into being cool enough, especially at this age, to enter the world of art as it is now, and the rest is kind of more decorative. But in terms of what I do, the kind of people that come and see my paintings, who visit me or have seen one online with you and so forth, they tend to enjoy them. And I paint like that. I paint things that I like to paint.
my last question. How does somebody with pretty prominent dyslexia become a New York Times best-selling author in both fiction and non-fiction?
Well, when I was in school, in a boarding school in England, the dyslexia was a problem because people would put a red line through everything I wrote because every word was spelt wrong, not some, every. So basically, when I came out of an educational environment in the 50s and 60s in which spelling was a thing, as soon as you can get close enough with spell check now. So basically, if I want to spend the time correcting all my spelling before I send a manuscript to my agent, my deficit was not in the inability to write conceptually. My deficit was literally in the mechanics of seeing letters backwards and that kind of thing. So I'm a very fortunate dyslexic,
Mhm.
because both the technology but also the period of history I live in means that, once I got out of the school environment, so even back in boarding school, my teachers would say things like, "Oh, well, if this essay was spelt correctly, you'd get a good grade because the ideas are good," that kind of thing. So writing was not my problem any more than conversation was. Some dyslexic, that the actual writing, putting a thought down is tough. They don't think that way. I have always thought verbally, I just can't spell anything. I can look at a word 1,000 times. I mean, you know, my most amusing thing is to try to spell dyslexia.
Right.
It's a tough
Well,
one. It's a
there
I
you
just
go.
can't see it right. I mean, my fingers will not hit. So my limits with spell check are dictated by the fact that I have to get close enough so even the kindest computer program knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Google's good for that. So yeah, that's what I use as my default. If I can't spell hors d'oeuvre, I go to Google and there it is. So
Hey, and in the final analysis, having just badmouthed tech, I can say, "Hi Siri, how do you spell?" Hi Siri, how do you spell? And then if I can't, so I can verbalize enough so that I can get close, and then I copy that down. And
Frank, you're just wonderful. I loved your essay. It made me think. I've been following the Powell Amendment and this 2025 for a long time, but it was your observations that I think really put it into better understanding for
thank
me.
you.
And I will link that, and people should join your Substack and follow you. Your writing, your uh, since
Appreciate
uh,
that.
since your August Substack, you've had many, many more that we could have podcasts
Yeah,
about.
and if they go to my art page, frankschaefferart.com, take a look. They can see more of the paintings if they're interested. And then the Substack, I have my commentaries, it has to be said. And then, you know, my podcast is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and it's on YouTube and where podcasts are found. So,
And you just had James Carville on
yes,
recently,
we
right?
did. We've had some really interesting people. And also, you mentioned some of the women authors we've had. Um, you know, Krista Brown, Baptist Land, all these things, a well-trained wife, Tia Levings. We've had wonderful authors, you know, women basically. I understand where they're coming from pushing back against the evangelical patriarchy, because sadly, I was one of them. And so it's always informative to have somebody on who writes about, you know, maybe back in the day being married to someone who is a little too familiar to me because I was in that camp. So, you know, I'm somebody that looks at these things through the eyes of someone who's kind of played both sides of this game, but has come up, I think, at the right place now. Um, you know, that doesn't mean I see everything clearly, but I see one thing clearly. I'm very, very fortunate that I escaped.
Well, there's more than one way to be born again, I guess, is
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
proof of that.
yeah,
So
exactly,
thank
exactly.
you so much.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Pat.
Bye.
Okay, bye.